Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Wondrium. Here's the little app on my phone. You just touch it like that. It opens right up to lots and lots of content. Of course, you can access this online as well. It's a subscription system. It's the old great courses, now expanded to be called Wondrium, that includes documentary series and other educational programs besides just the great courses. And their lectures, which, as you know, if you've listened to the show, you know I love. I consume them constantly. I've produced a couple myself. Here's the latest one I'm listening to. This one is called World War II, Up Close and Personal. Experience the startling realities of the Second World War through the eyes of the people who lived them. So I'm almost done. Actually, I think I had 3 more lectures to go in this particular course. This is 24 lectures. Each of them are about 30 minutes long. I listen to them at 1.25 speed, so that's about 20 minutes per lecture. So here are some of the lectures. Just great. Hitler and the Nazi Youth, Japanese soldiers in Nanjing, Panza leaders who changed warfare, Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto, the besieged in Leningrad, the bomber will always get through. Let's see, the submarine, what it's like to be on a U.S. submarine, and the eyes and ears of war correspondents, what it's like to be a kamikaze pilot. What were these people thinking? Anyway, this is a great course. I love it. So you can access this through my podcast for free for a month. And it's so if you go to the wondrium.com/Shermer, you get the free month trial. And so give it a try. It costs nothing. It's free for the first month, and you can access just thousands and thousands of pieces of educational material that's well worth listening. So check it out. Again, go to Wondrium, wondrium.com/Shermer, and you get your free trial. All right. Thanks for listening. Okay, my guest today is none other than the great Phil Zimbardo. Most of you will know who he is. Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Stanford University, who also taught at Yale University, New York University, and Columbia University. He's the co-author of Psychology and Life, a general textbook, and the author of Shyness, which together have sold more than 2.5 million copies. He's been president of the American Psychological Association and is now director of the Stanford Center on Interdisciplinary Policy, Education, and Research on Terrorism. He also narrated the award-winning PBS series Discovering Psychology, which he helped create. In 2004, he acted as an expert witness in the court-martial hearings of one of the American Army reservists accused of criminal behavior in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. His informative website, www.prisonexperiment.org, is visited by millions every year. At that website, you can access his 20-page response to the several criticisms of him and his Stanford Prison Experiment, in which, if you only read the critiques, you would just want to basically cancel Phil Zimbardo, defenestrate all of his work from psychology textbooks. I've had couple guests on this podcast say essentially that. I think that's a mistake. If you go ahead, read the criticisms, but also read his point-by-point rebuttal. There are legitimate criticisms of the Stanford Prison Experiment, which really wasn't even an experiment, more of a demonstration. But even if it's all wrong, as I point out in this episode, Abu Ghraib is kind of a natural experiment in which pretty much everything that happened in the Stanford Prison Experiment happened in spades in Abu Ghraib. So you still have to explain that in that context. Anyway, we talk about not just that. I opened discussing some of that, but I didn't want to put him on trial. You can just read the document himself, and I didn't want to go through point by point. But we do discuss some of that, but then also get into the nature of human nature. What does it mean to say the situation causes good people to do bad things? Situation is too broad a concept. What exactly are they doing? What are the factors at work? And which situations lead to bad behavior and which don't? Because most people don't join cults. Most people don't become Nazis and do evil things. Why not, if that's in our nature? So we drill down into all of that and discuss free will and determinism and moral culpability. If all these factors are so powerful, how do you hold people accountable? Well, we do. He does. And look at all that in the context of the attempt by social psychology to explain how Germans became Nazis, how any evil happens, how genocides happen. Why Derek Chauvin did what he did, but more importantly, why were there other police officers just standing there? Why didn't somebody intervene? What's going on with that? And if all police are corrupt like that, why doesn't this happen every day? Because it doesn't happen every day. Well, it happens enough. You can see it on the evening news fairly regularly, which makes it seem like it's a systemic problem. But in fact, tens of millions of encounters between police and citizens, 99.9% of which never end in violence. So why is that? Anyway, this is one of the great conversations of the podcast. Phil is now 88 years old, so he's had a long life. So at the end, I asked him to put the last year and a half into perspective. To what extent is he optimistic or pessimistic about human nature and moral progress? Even though the book has now been out for well over a decade, I think it's 14 years now, The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil, I still think is one of the classics to be read in the general area of evil and bad behavior and why it happens. It is, again, not without its critics. That's fine. That's how science works. But I do encourage you to read it. So that's why we're highlighting it in this episode, even though it's not a new book, which I usually focus on. Anyway, Phil is one of the more interesting people of our time. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation. I'm happy to have you on the show. There's so much I want to talk to you about. Let's start off with a disclaimer that, which you mentioned several times in your book, not the specific one, but that trying to explain evil does not in any way condone it. So here's the disclaimer I always like to read from Louis Fry Richardson, the meteorologist who turned later in his life to try to understand the cause of war, for which he was criticized as if he was saying, explaining it means to forgive it. And he says, for indignation is so easy in satisfying a mood that it is apt to prevent one from attending to any facts that oppose it. If the reader should object that I have abandoned ethics for the false doctrine that to understand all is to forgive all, I can reply that it is only a temporary suspension of ethical judgment made because to condemn much is to understand little. I think that's appropriate for today because of today's cancel culture. It's easy to, pile on Twitter or social media and condemn people. But really, your whole life has been trying to understand why good people do bad things. And more specifically, how did World War II happen? How did educated, cultured Germans turn into Nazis? So maybe just start off for our listeners who are not deeply familiar with your background, how you came to this lifelong career study of this problem, and where you grew up and how your culture influenced your interests.
Yeah, I should. Well, thank you for having me as your guest, Michael. I think we talked many years ago, I think at your home, if I remember. And so I'm in San Francisco right now. And I'm going back in time to when I was a child, growing up in a ghetto in the South Bronx, filled with poor people surviving, mostly second-generation immigrants. My family was Sicilian, uneducated. And if you grow up in any ghetto then and now, you're surrounded by evil. There are older guys and men trying to get kids to take drugs from one corner to another corner, to break into stores at night to steal. And some of my friends gave into that temptation because we were poor. This was instant money. In fact, they would put money in your hand and say, if you do this, if you do the thing right, we'll double it or something. And some of my friends who did that ended up getting caught and going to jail. So I was always interested in, temptation. Also, I was a good Catholic kid, and in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So I was always interested in evil and temptation and why some kids give in and others don't. And so that's been a foundation. And then when I became a psychologist, I was attracted to social psychology and research by Muzafer Sherif, old-time Turkish psychologist, who invited kids to a summer camp, not knowing that at the summer camp, they would divide the kids into two groups, the rattlers and the eagles, I think, and encourage them to have a conflict uh, because they wanted to see how what can you do to reduce a conflict. So they were interested in a good ending, but before you got there, these were kids on the loose on a summer camp for 2 weeks, I think. And for me, that's the most unethical study ever done, but it was fascinating at that time. And then there were other kinds of studies by Solomon Asch on conformity, how easy it is for smart, intelligent college students to yield their visual point of view to be like the group. So that, and then of course Stanley Milgram, who was my high school classmate in the Bronx, James Monroe High School. We graduated 1950. He did the first studies on obedience to authority, and curiously, when we were in high school, it was 48, 49. It wasn't that far from the Second World War. And he would say, could the Holocaust happen again? Could he and his family end up in a concentration camp? We'd say, Stanley, we're not that kind of people. We're not, he said, Germans. And he said, how do you know what you would do until you're in the same situation? So he was an 18-year-old situationist then. And then he went on in the 60s to do his blind obedience to authority study. And it was fascinating. But my follow-up was, it's very rare that you're in a situation where authority tells you to do something bad. That typically you're in a situation where you're playing a role. You're a used car salesman, and the boss tells you got to sell a certain number of cars a day. And some of these are clunkers, and you got to sell a bad car to somebody who's can't afford to pay for anything more. So the prison study really came out of that background, trying to understand how when you put good people, and I use college students, Milgram used just adults from New Haven, Connecticut, ages 20 to 50. And I wanted bright, intelligent college students that we were going to, they had just finished summer school at Berkeley and at Stanford. And I knew they had 2 weeks free before, in those days, the fall term started after Labor Day. So I knew they had 2 weeks free, and the study was going to go for 1 to 2 weeks. And they could all we paid them $15 a day, which they could use during that downtime. So that's how that was the background for doing the prison study.
Yeah, I should point out that when I lecture on these topics, I ask students, how many of you would flip the toggle switch all the way up to 450 volts, when I show them Milgram's videotapes from the 1960s. And of course, they all go, well, I wouldn't do that. Then I show a remake we did. We sort of did a replication for NBC Dateline in 2010. And, and we had 6 people, 4 of them through the switches, 3 of them went all the way. And I also asked them, how many of you would, become Nazis, or how many of you would have been abolitionists during the, say 1850s in America? And they all say, oh, I would definitely stand up to slavery. I would have been an abolitionist. And to me, this is just delusional. No, you wouldn't. Most people would not have been abolitionists in the 1850s America, particularly in the South. We're all modern enlightened thinkers thinking we would do this, but until you're actually in that situation, you don't know how you'll act. And I should point out, too, you make a point of this in your book. By the way, I reread The Lucifer Effect, and we're going to plug that on, even though this has been out now since 2007. I still think it's a great book. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, you're welcome. No, that you and Milgram and others are usually considered politically liberal, and that your theories are supposedly, liberal type arguments in a way, as I started off saying, excusing the criminal or whatever. That's not what you're doing. But in point of fact, as you note, the broken windows theory of crime, which is endorsed mainly by conservatives, is exactly what you're arguing, that if you have a rundown situation in which the local norms are graffiti and broken windows and turnstile jumpers and so on, then that kind of enables or allows or encourages other forms of crime. This episode of the show is brought to you by Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and an app that teaches you how to think and solve problems with fun, interactive lessons in STEM. You know STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. It's all the rage. With Brilliant's hands-on approach, you'll learn by doing instead of just listening to lectures. Research in cognitive psychology, for example, shows that learning is greatly enhanced when learners are actively engaged in doing something with the material, rather than passively listening to a teacher. Thus, Brilliant has pioneered a better and more fun way to learn. All of Brilliant's courses have storytelling, code writing, interactive challenges, along with problems to solve. Brilliant offers many well-curated sequences of problems that help you master all sorts of technical subjects. For example, let's say you're interested in physics. You could try out their courses on classical mechanics, or if you're really brave, gravitational physics. Oh boy. And their hands-on interactive approach will help you master the material far faster and deeper than you would just watching some professor at a blackboard. Or if you like computers and coding, you can check out their courses on computer science fundamentals and programming with Python. Ooh. Also with hands-on interactive modules. So Brilliant has a vast array of courses that can help you achieve your goals in STEM, starting with one small commitment to learning and building up to long-term challenges and growth. To check out the many courses available and find out the one that's right for you, you can go to brilliant.org/Michael Shermer and sign up for free. Again, that's brilliant.org/Michael Shermer. And the first 200 people that go to this link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. Once again, that's brilliant.org/Michael Shermer. Thanks for listening to the show, and I encourage you to give Brilliant a try. Again, one last time, brilliant.org/Michael Shermer. So in fact, it could be a theory that could cut either liberal or conservative.
Yeah, I don't see it as a political. I mean, I think now I actually did the only experiment in the broken windows theory that they use. When I was at New York University way back in the 60s, I planted 2 used cars in two different places. One in a rundown area near the university, and we just took the license plate off. So it was an abandoned car, and the idea was how long before somebody called the police to tow it away, and instead what happened within minutes, and then we have a video of it. People, passers-by, took everything useful from the car, the seats, and one of them even jacked it up, took a tire. And then amazingly, they began to smash the car, to break the windows, just for the pleasure of destruction. And then we did the same thing at Stanford University, left this car in a highly visible place on the campus, and no one touched it. In fact, I had, at the end, I had a sledgehammer. I would have to ask people when you pass by, could you do me a favor? Could you hit my car? And they say, are you crazy? But once they started hitting, it was like this abandonment that they really enjoyed doing it. So that was part of the broken windows theory, that abandoned cars, depending where they're abandoned, will get destroyed by passers-by if it's in a bad neighborhood where the norm is do whatever you can, get away with bad shit, and not in good neighborhoods.
Yeah, and again, to make the point, these aren't Germans versus Americans. They're all Americans. They're Westerners. They, presumably have the same kind of culture, and yet acting very differently. So it's the local norms or community, or maybe social proof. I guess maybe Robert Cialdini might call it that. If you see others doing it, it's proof that it's okay or it's not okay, depending on what they're doing. That would be something like a situation. Part of the reason, just to pull back for a minute and reflect on the recent criticisms of your work, there's nothing wrong with people criticizing theories, and that's been part of the replication crisis in psychology. So some of that's good. I think part of it is that the bigger the target, the more likely people are going to come after you. So I think that's one reason we're seeing some of this. I've noticed this in my career. Back in the, say, 80s, 70s and 80s, Carl Sagan and Stephen Jay Gould got hammered a lot. And it's not that they were saying anything different than other theorists. It's just that they were, prominent figures. And then, in the 90s, maybe Steven Pinker in the 2000s, Stephen Hawking,
right.
Anybody that is prominent particularly on television or in visual media, where, whatever their particular theories are, people just tend to want to go after them. Again, that's not to dismiss whether criticisms are legitimate or not. It's just in case you're wondering why now and why you,
right.
Well, this is one reason. You're a pretty prominent figure. And then the other thing, I think it's just a quirk of our cognition, is that we tend to associate somebody with just one thing that they're most known for, whether it's good or bad. And outside of science, you're most famous for the Stanford Prison Experiment. I'm on a bike ride this morning with my buddies. I go, hey, I got to get back early because I got the great Phil Zimbardo on my show. They're like, who's that? These are just cyclists, like just local cyclists. I said, the Stanford Prison Experiment guy. Oh, that guy. Yeah. All right. I mean, you have this massive body of work for the last 70 years, and that's the one thing, people outside of the field know you for. It's just that goes with the turf, Phil. People are going to go after you because you're prominent and after the one thing that you're known for, even though you're known for 20 other things.
Yeah, I should mention that on August 15th of this year, it'll be the 50th anniversary of that infamous experiment. So there are two companies doing documentary films about it. Hopefully, will be released at the August 15th anniversary date.
Oh, interesting. Yes. Well, certainly people have been criticizing your so-called experiments since the very beginning, even in the dramatic film about the Stanford Prison Experiment that shows the character playing you running in the hallway to another one of your colleagues who says something like, Phil, what kind of experiment's this? Where's the control group? And so that kind of pushback was there from the very beginning.
Right. Yeah. It's humorous. In part, the reason Milgram's study got a lot of attention was the video he did of it. Had he only published the article, which he did later, it would never have gotten this attention. And the same thing, I made a video called Quiet Rage of the study, really intended for teachers. And I made it available, for $99 a section. But in that you could see and hear the brutality of many of the guards increasing over days, and you could see the suffering of the prisoners and crying, literally college students playing the role of prisoners who are being beaten down verbally, physically, crying like little babies. And so I think it's the seeing human nature demeaned in that way, upfront and personal. You can never get that from simply words. You can't imagine words to the reality. So I think it's the visual presentation of both of those studies that gave them instant attention and quote instant fame.
Yeah, well, and then in most of those documentaries, they usually then flash back to Eichmann on trial in Jerusalem or Nazi guards lined up shooting Jews into pits, stuff like that. And but even if to whatever extent you coached or suggested to the so-called guards how they should act, I should point out, although I want you to address that point, that Milgram's experiment, he told them exactly how they were supposed to act. Here's what you are to do. You are to read this list of words. When they get it wrong, hit one of those toggle switches and put electricity into their bodies. So even if you told them how to act, that's not the point. The point is, why are they acting this way? And, after Milgram, several of Milgram's subjects later said, oh, I knew it was fake. And, I never went along. I wouldn't do anything like that. Well, that's just cognitive dissonance. And I think The one guard you had who
Right.
said decades later, he said, "Oh, I knew it was all fake. I was faking the whole way. I wasn't really being a badass." And then the prisoner who threw that tantrum fit to get out now says, he just did it to get out to study for his GREs or whatever, to get in graduate school, and he wasn't really upset. Well, I've watched all those videos. To me, it's like, I don't know. This sounds like these Milgram subjects with cognitive dissonance saying, no, I'm not like that. I wouldn't have done that. A little post hoc rationalization. So which time are you lying? The time when during the experiment, right after when those documentaries filmed you, or decades later when you now say, oh, I never really participated in that in any genuine way. I don't know. Those kind of criticisms to me are fraught with problems like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, in the Milgram study, you could have quit. I mean, to say, I was fake. I didn't know what it means to fake it. You knew you were pressing a button, and you had to believe that the person yelling and screaming was the guy you just saw, and quote, your student. And so, at any point, well, some people did quit. Not everybody went to 450 volts. So 2 of every 3 went all the way. So 1/3 did quit, say, I'm not going on further. but the critical thing about Milgram's study, it's the seduction into evil. You press one button, 15 volts, nothing happens. But you see before you this machine that has 30 switches, and when it gets to 300, there's XXX, extreme shock. So they wouldn't have a machine like this if they didn't expect some people to go all the way. And once you press that first button, then you're on that slippery slope. 15 is easy, nothing happens. Then it's 45, nothing. Then next fall, then it gets to 100. You hear the person beginning to yell, but not yelling very much. So it's something that we should consider, that when people do evil things, it's never the big thing first. It's really getting seduced into evil. I'm saying it's like the kids in my neighborhood in the Bronx, that you do a little thing, you steal a little bit, you lie a little bit, you carry a package of what you're not sure what it is, but it must be drugs, down the street. And so once you step off from being a good kid to not so good kid, then you're on that slippery slope. And again, in my study, I recently wrote a 20-page rebuttal of every single criticism study. And so, for example, prisoner 8612, Doug Corpy, he was the one who later said, he was the first one to break down. And he later said, oh, he was faking it. Well, it turns out that not only was he not faking it, he did an interview later on when he was the chief psychologist in the San Francisco County Jail. His whole life is now reorganized around helping prisoners be not so ashamed, and helping guards be not so cruel. And he did his dissertation at Berkeley after he left the study on shame and guilt. So that was his Ph.D. dissertation, and he spent the rest of his life as a prison psychologist in this San Francisco County Jail. If that's not a impact of research on not only the way you think, but on your whole behavior. And then we also have a video of him saying 10 years later that this was the worst experience in his life, that he lost control of himself and he was humiliated. And that's why he became a psychologist.
Interesting. Yes. Well, it'd be interesting to ask him now, which is the lie that you're telling, the one that you said now, or the one 10 years after the fact, or the one during the experience and immediately
Right.
after. I mean, people change their minds. I understand that. There's a whole psychology there. But I find these criticisms disturbing because I've had 2 guests recently. I won't name them, but they both kind of tossed into the conversation when we got talking about the replication crisis. Oh, yeah, we don't need to talk about the Stanford Prison Experiment or Zimbardo's work anymore. That can be defenestrated from the textbooks. It's like, what? No. That's not correct. I've read the criticisms very carefully. I refer readers to your webpage where you have that 20-page point by point response, which that's how science works, right? People criticize, conjecture, refutation, you refute, and we go back and forth. As I read it, I still think it's the whole thing is part of a whole package of trying to understand the complexities of human nature. The gradualism part, for example, the Nazis, they didn't just start off gassing Jews and shooting them into pits. In mid 1933, shortly after Hitler came into power, they started the euthanasia program. Well, first the sterilization program, and then the euthanasia program of their own citizens, not Jews, German citizens who were mentally handicapped, physically handicapped, work shy, or whatever. And step by step, you can see the laws changing in 1936, 37, 38. By the time they implemented the death camps in the early 1940s, they had already had, like 100 steps toward that, in which it was totally acceptable to do these things to your own people, and then to otherize Jews, say, for example, or gypsies or homosexuals, was just an easy step.
Yeah, but also it's the other steps were Jews had to wear a yellow Star of David that identified them as Jews different from others. And many of them wore it proudly. But then Jews were not allowed to go to school. And then Jews were not allowed to have stores of their own. So this was the Nazi slippery slope of evil. They just kept increasing the restraint, the pressure on Jews. They could not work. Then they had to live in ghettos. And it wasn't until later on that they began to say everybody in this ghetto is going to be relocated when they put them in a boxcar and ship them to concentration camps. So it was evil doesn't happen instantly. Evil happens gradually, and the important thing about rational people is to be aware that when you're in a situation where evil is beginning to emerge, sift up, that then it's the time you have to blow the whistle. You have to get people noticing what is happening. Right now, the most amazing thing I've heard in my life is there are now Republicans who's saying that the January 6th insurrection against the Capitol was nothing more than tourists going to visit the Capitol.
Incredible.
So that's a different kind of evil. That's the evil of failing to acknowledge evil is its own kind of destructive evil, especially when it's by any in a position of power, because they have followers.
I was thinking about this, the complexity of human nature, and to explaining any human behavior, we can either underdetermine it, or overdetermine it. I think probably multiple variables are always at work at any one time. Why did not everybody go through that kind of evil process? Why did some people resist? Your whole heroism project addresses that. If you look at like Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, about that citizen police force 109 that got pushed into the Einsatzgruppen to shoot Jews in pits and so forth. They had a hard time doing it. Most people are not inclined to do that sort of thing until they get used to it. And they had to go to great lengths to help them get used to it. And a lot of these guys just got shit-faced after they killed people. I mean, they just drank themselves into oblivion because it was so upsetting. There's even a story about Himmler, the first time he saw one of these open pit shootings, vomited on the side of on the road there, just because it's just so disconcerting until you have that slow, gradual process to do what? Well, are we by nature disinclined to do that kind of thing? And it takes a lot of work to get people to do it. Plus the norms have to change and so on. Or are we are we inclined to do it? And it's easy to get people to do it by tweaking the situation a little bit. In other words, so there's a deeper theory here. Is civilization just a thin veneer over this Hobbesian war of all against all, and that the situation that you talk about just releases the hounds within, or is it something else? Give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, but it is it is the power of the social situation. So, and what Christopher Browning was showing was that these are old soldiers, too old to fight in battle, and they arranged them to go to remote villages to line up the Jews there and kill them. And when they started, nobody wanted to do it. The captain kept saying, "You have to do it. This is an order." And only a few of them actually shot women and children. And then what happened was the ones who did it felt guilty in face of the others who didn't. And so all of this, the evidence is that they began to put pressure on their buddies to say, you know, you got to come along. You got to join in. It's an order. So now the guys who did bad are putting pressure on the guys who resisted. And what Browning shows is each day when they went to another city, another town, more of the non-participants joined in until at the end everyone is doing it, and then everyone is doing it apparently with joy in their heart. That killing Jews began to be a fun activity. So again, it's the social norm. Got to be the social norm. Doing bad was good in that realm. You were following orders of the superiors, but also the ones who did it first felt guilt, and they're putting pressure on their buddies to be like them. So it's a complex, really, set of social psychological principles at work, but the principles really help explain how good people can do bad things.
I just had David Buss on the podcast talking about his new book on why men behave badly, kind of in the context of the Me Too movement. And, again, there's multiple factors. It's not like all men walking around are just walking around as would-be rapists. Most men are not rapists. Most men would not sexually assault women. So why do some do that? Well, it's a part of human nature. Our evolved psychology is that men think about sex a lot. They want more sex partners than women, and so on. So David went through all that. But then you have what's called the dark triad. That is, some men have high in narcissism, that is entitled self-importance, high in Machiavellianism, strategic exploitation and duplicity, and high in psychopathy, callousness and cynicism and lack of empathy. So if you put those together with the evolved human psychology, and then you put them in a position of power, like a CEO or a film director, where you have access to young, attractive women, and then it all kind of comes together. So it's not just the situation, right? It's also part of human psychology inside the person.
Yeah. I know David very well. It's really a brilliant analysis, and it's that triad, as you said. And then the triads put it in a box of power. You're now in a position of power. And also, in many of these cases, it's really enjoying the power, because it's not clear that these men are not particularly ugly. That if they made a pass at a young woman, that she might say, "Sure, I'll go on a date with you. Sure, I'll I'm willing to sleep with you, whatever." But it's the dynamism of having the power to get a woman to give in to your demands. So it's using that power. And now, as you said earlier, it's the power that a young woman working for you, working in your business, dependent on your recommendation, depending on your goodwill, depending on the money they're making as salary. But it's ugly. I want to switch us to something positive about, you mentioned earlier my hero project.
Yeah.
So again, it's the same. It's the same thing. It's that, how is it possible for an ordinary person to act heroically? And by act heroically, we simply mean come to the aid of others in need, or be willing to defend a moral cause, and knowing that there's some risk. If you help somebody in need, you could get hurt. If you blow the whistle on corruption in your business, you could lose your job, or you could get demoted. So there is some risk, and the problem that I faced when I started thinking about this is our notion of heroes are really extraordinary individuals. So we have Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Madame Curie, people who's sacrificed their lives for a belief, for a cause. And I'm saying, no, what I'm talking about is anyone, including youth, who are willing to stand up, speak out, and take action to make the world better in some way. And it could even be make the world better by getting a classmate to stop bullying some other kid. So I began 10 years ago saying, let me try to use my social psychological knowledge for good. No more putting people in prison. It's actually liberating people from prisons of inactivity, prisons of passivity, and so I started what I called the Heroic Imagination Project, or HIP, a nonprofit foundation in San Francisco. And the idea was I would develop, along with my colleagues, a set of lessons that we would use to teach people how to be a hero, how to be, instead of a passive bystander, an active upstander, how to change prejudice and discrimination, understanding and acceptance of others, how to develop a growth mindset where everything is possible if you put in enough effort and enough practice. And so I developed these lessons, and they're like 3 or 4 hour chunks, and that we use these in high school, college, and now many businesses are interested. And the program is going viral. It's in 12 nations. So the program is going viral. It's in every high school all over Hungary and Poland, even in Iran. And so I usually go to these. Well, before the pandemic, I literally would anybody who would write to me saying we're interested in your program, and they license the program for a small fee, but it includes me training the teachers, or in businesses training the human development people. And we have evidence that it works. There's reduction in bullying, reduction in prejudice. There's a sense of enhanced self-esteem that I now have the power to do good in these ways. And so, all I'm saying for you is it's heroicimagination.org.
How would let's apply that to the current problem with police violence against African Americans and the BLM movement and so on. That there's this kind of general tenor now that there's systemic racism throughout America, and that most cops or most police departments are corrupt and racist. Now, I don't think that's true. I think there's bad apples for sure. Maybe dark triad cops or whatever. But let's say the local San Francisco police called you in and said, Phil, we want to help train our cops to all be heroes, and that their job is to help people and not hurt people. What should we do? And how
Right.
how might you apply that to the nationwide issue of cops and violence?
Yeah, it's really. I'm glad you asked that question, because I've been thinking about that, and really, what has to change is cadet training. So we know very little. Obviously there's a training period. You say, to be a cop is a job, and you apply for this job, and then if you're selected to begin, there must be some physical criteria, but then you go through some training. We don't know what's in that training. Clearly, the training we know now has to have a major social psychological component. They have to understand implicit bias, that all of us have biases, against people of different color, people of different gender, people of different, there's age bias. So we want to actually make them sensitive, aware of the biases that they have, And then also make them aware of situational forces that could get good people to do bad things. So we would show them the Milgram study. We showed them a little bit of the prison study, and part of it then is we would give them the orientation that they should not simply want to be a good cop; they should want to be a heroic cop. That they should, and so I would love to be able to work with any police department to restructure their cadet training, because I think that's where it really has to be. And it's time. I mean, it's time. I mean, police killing minority men and now even women has not stopped. I mean, it's pathetic. Almost every day on the evening news, there's another incident. I can't even look anymore. And a policeman. Now it's not always black. It was recently a Hispanic man. So it's
and
minorities
and whites. Most people don't know the Tony Timpa video that's on there that looks just like the George Floyd video, but it's a white guy in Texas, and they got the knee on the neck, and he ends up dying, and it's hard to watch. In fact, though, what you're describing in part is the availability heuristic. That is, yes, we see it on the news every night. It just seems like it's an epidemic, almost a pandemic of violence. In fact, there's something like 30 to 40 million encounters per year of police and citizens, mainly just speeding tickets and whatever, just nothing. The problem arises when, let's say, it's inner city African Americans who don't trust the police, and for good reason, historically, it was pretty bad. Yeah. And so maybe when push comes to shove, they run. So what should the police do if the suspect bolts and takes off, like the guy that was asleep in the line at the Wendy's in Atlanta? And, they talked to him for like an hour. And then they decided for whatever reason, we're going to cuff this guy. They had the keys to his car. They knew where he lived. And he just takes off, and they end up shooting him dead. And, so as I understand it, police are trained to always control the situation. Don't let it get out of control. So if the guy runs, you've lost control. Maybe that's where the training needs to shift. Why not just let him go? Because they know where he lives. Where's he going? Rather than shoot him.
Yeah, but that's it. It's the sense of you have to control the situation. You're right. You don't want the situation to control you, but control the situation means to understand it. So it's when a policeman is under stress, as we know, stress, your understanding gets focused, very narrow. You don't have the broad picture. If somebody runs, they're running away. People run away from police when they are doing bad things or get caught. Well, if you know where he lives and you have his car, you don't have to run after him. You don't have to shoot him to stop. The other thing I always wonder, how come police are not trained to shoot people in the leg?
Because it's hard to hit. I'm told that it's hard to do. The torso is easier to hit than the leg.
Well, yeah, but still,
it happens so fast. You have like 1.5 seconds to make a decision. Yeah. There's no rationality there.
But it's shoot to. I mean, but the idea, we don't want to get into detail, but the focus seems always shoot to kill rather than shoot to stop. If you put 20 bullets or 10 bullets, focusing on somebody's leg, you're going to hit a leg and they're going to fall down, and that's all you just want them to stop. You don't want them to die. You just want them to not run away, so that you could capture them.
Well, there may be better better taser technology would be an improvement. I don't know. I also was watching a Joe Rogan podcast with Jocko Willink, the ex-Navy SEAL, who trains people now on different things, and he points out that grappling with somebody physically, you're in their grips and you're going and you're down on the ground. He says if you don't practice that, if you're not used to it, it's very upsetting. You just lose control completely of yourself, and if there's guns involved, somebody's going to get shot. So the moment you reach into the cop car or you grab the cop or something, it's just all hell breaks loose. And as far as we know, police don't get regular training on, grabbing somebody and physically controlling them. and except for in training and maybe once a year or something. Jocko says they in the Navy SEALs they practice it every week because it's so abnormal.
Yeah.
It's so emotionally disruptive that you have to kind of train to how to do that.
Yeah, well, we should have Navy SEALs training our police.
Yeah.
No, but it's we forget that. I mean, you get training as you're a cadet, and now if you're 3-year, 5-year out in the service, it's been a long time since you've been trained even how to physically hold somebody down, or how to make an arrest, to twist somebody's arm behind them. So it's not clear to me. Is there regular updated training? That's the other thing. It should be, retraining like every 3 years, certainly every 5 years.
Now, let's apply your model to that video we've all now seen of the Derek Chauvin, the knee on the neck of George Floyd, and the other officers standing there. Why didn't any of them intervene? Is it because he was the superior officer and it's sort of an obedience to authority, or it's a sort of a situation in which the norm is this is what we do, or it's kind of a social approval? Well, this is what the boss is doing, so we can't intervene. What you're saying? And let's assume that most cops are good people; they're not bad apples. Maybe Chauvin is a bad apple. Maybe he's a dark triad, and he's a racist asshole, and he deserves what he has coming to him in his sentencing. But let's assume most cops are not Derek Chauvin, and yet still there they are standing there watching him do this. Why didn't they stop him?
Yeah, that was what was most upsetting to me when I watched that video that the little girl made. Is there were four other cops, and all they had standing watching, doing nothing. All they had to do is say he's contained. Let's bring him back to the car. They said they were. It was almost as if they were mesmerized watching this event happening before them, and not taking responsibility. Now, yes, he's the captain, he's the boss, but still, there are things you should say that to alleviate the situation, the danger of the situation. To say, boss, I think we've got him secured, period. But again, as you said, it went on for a long, long time where nobody said anything, nobody did anything. You could have just put your hand on Chauvin's back and say, I think you got the situation under control. Anything like that would have broken. It was almost a hypnotic thing between Chauvin and this beast below him, beneath him. And so, yes, so that again would be in police training. I mean, you take that video, and so that would be part of what I would have in a police training thing. Show that thing and say, okay, now imagine you are one of those four cops. What should you do? What would you do? What could you do? What should you have done? What will you do in the future?
Yeah, I remember after some of those Asian airline accidents happened, when the co-pilot knew that there was a problem but was afraid to say something to the pilot because he's the boss. And so part of their training after those was to encourage lower ranked pilots to say something. If you see something, say something, and it's okay to kind of buck the authority or challenge the authority.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, that's so deeply ingrained in us, is that in every situation, there's somebody who should be in charge. And in some cases, the person in charge, might not be mentally aware, might have, might have just have amnesia or fainting or any number of things. So it's not that they're doing anything bad, but they are not mentally fit or physically fit to do their job. And the reason you're an assistant pilot is for that reason, that you have to step in. You have to say, I will take charge. But again, this is training. And what we're talking about is human psychology, human nature. Why is it that if you are second in command, you don't challenge the first in command when you know that person is not doing the job appropriately or rightly. Um, and so this is training not only of the police but the pilots, again in the military. So we have to clean up our act more and more.
Again, I think I like your model because it assumes people are basically pretty good, most of them, except for the dark triad folks or whatever. And I was thinking about this in our previous discussion we had. I think that was at Diane Halpern's house. You were visiting there, and I came up to her house where I lived there and interviewed you for my book, The Mind of the Market. But there we were talking about Enron and WorldCon. I was thinking about that recently. Yes, those were bad. Those were bad people, really corrupt corporations. Yet if you take, say, the Fortune 500 corporations, most of them don't turn into WorldCons and Enrons and are corrupt environments. So I guess the question is, how do you explain why there aren't more of those or more My Lai? You write about My Lai in Vietnam. That there was a pretty horrible situation for a lot of soldiers, yet most soldiers don't turn into Cali and shoot children and women at close range and so on. Most people don't act like that.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm saying most people are good most of the time. It just, in some situations, something happens where somebody, for some reason, does the wrong thing. And that's the point at which others are supposed to stop them or prevent them or saying, that's what you're doing is not right. So like somebody like Callie, just went crazy and was not stopped. So again, it's the heroic imagination project says your job sometimes is to stop evil in the most reasonable way possible without getting yourself into danger. But sometimes it's simply calling out, saying stop, or why are you doing this, or getting somebody to break through that evil mindset of killing. And so this is what we're saying, is that there, in some situations, it's easy for someone to go off, to go down that evil path, to press that next button when they should have stopped. And part of it is, how do you get people to be rational when they're in the hardest thing, when they're in a dangerous situation? Well, right now, for the first time in years, we've seen the Palestinians and the Israelis, bombing each other, and again, innocent civilian children getting killed, and how will it end? So again, the good news is, Biden's sending a staff to try to work out a resolution, a compromise. But so the other thing is, let's say with Israeli and Palestinians, there gets to be a deep hatred of the other. So this is, Turks and Armenians, from years ago. And in many cases, like even in Italy, northern Italians think badly of southern Italians. and there it's a way of thinking, and then there's jokes about it that justify it. And then it turns out that in Italy, the police, if police arrest somebody from the south, they're going to treat a northern policeman in Milan is going to treat somebody worse if they are Southern Italian. I could tell from their accent, than if they're Northern Italian. So it's almost like black and white, and so this within the country, within the same skin, except the built-in prejudice is Southern Italians are inferior to Northern Italians.
Interesting. Yes, we are very good at cataloging people by the minutest of differences. I wanted to ask you about
Right.
free will and determinism. You're a lifelong scientist looking for the causes of things. What effects are the result of certain causes, or determining factors, or influencing factors, or whatever the words are we want to use. You do ultimately hold people accountable, morally culpable for their actions, including, let's say, Derek Chauvin or the people involved in Abu Ghraib or whatever. But how do you square that circle? That you're looking for causal factors, and then the determinists may say, well, then they're just unlucky. They're unlucky that they were born with certain genes, or unlucky they were raised in these crappy environments, or unlucky that they ended up at Abu Ghraib in this environment in which everybody was abusing the prisoners, so they went along with it. And yet you then still hold them morally accountable. So how do you square those two?
Yeah, I mean, the situation helps explain why good people do bad things. It doesn't excuse those people from being responsible and guilty for the bad things. Uh, so again, I guess we always have to say there's a higher order, not a God-given order, not heaven, but there is a moral level of morality uh, should be within every nation, within every family that 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 identifies what actions, what behavior is not acceptable, is contrary to the best interest of of that family, of that nation group, uh, and so it's never excusable to harm other people, except when the other is the enemy and in a war. Uh, but so and it's a war that again has been approved by your government. So it's
Just war theory. Yeah. Here's how you
yeah, yeah,
define evil in the Lucifer Effect. Evil consists in intentionally behaving in ways that harm, abuse, demean, dehumanize, or destroy innocent others, or using one's authority and systemic power to encourage or permit others to do so on your behalf. In short, it's, quote, knowing better but doing worse. So in your model, then, at some point, the person knows that what they're doing is wrong. It's evil. If somebody had a brain tumor, or
yeah,
the McNaughton law thing about they're criminally insane and they didn't know what they were doing, so you lock them up in a mental institution instead of putting them in jail, something like that. But most people do not have brain tumors or criminally damaged brains. They just at some point know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway.
yeah. And it's again, it's you know what it means to have a society, a functioning society. There has to be laws that constrain people from doing things for selfish motives because they can get away with it. Stealing. You know, you learn it. You learn as a kid. You can't cheat on exams. Even though it's easy to do, and even though it doesn't hurt anybody. But the idea is that it gives you a false sense of power, and it also means that um, you're not putting in the effort to learn the material because you could simply cheat from somebody else who has put in that effort. And the idea is that if you start doing that as a kid in school and you get rewarded, you get a good grade for something you didn't work you don't deserve, then that might be something that you continue to do when you're an adult in situations that are more important than a geometry test. Um, so essentially, it's creating a culture from childhood up in which you say we want people to behave in certain ways because it's not only for the good of society, it's for the good of your mental health, your personal growth, and your sense of self-esteem. That one of the most important things is for people to have a sense that I'm a good person. I succeed when I work. I succeed when I work hard most of the time. Sometimes there's barriers or limits against me, and I will work to get around them. So the barriers and limits, for immigrants, when I grew up, the barriers were that, uh, immigrants were not accepted by, in quote, white society, and it was not white black. It was regular society, Americans who came there earlier, and in those days it was really literally, uh, you know, Irish against Italians, and then Italian against Jew. It was all the immigrants in a hierarchy, depending on when you got off the boat. Uh, that you established that you belong here first, um, uh, and so again, getting around. One of the great things about America has always been that we are a nation of immigrants from literally every country in the world, and more often than not, we work together in harmony. And we're always struck when we see the Derek Chauvin episodes, or any of the recent horrors. And again, it's not that these were not going on in the past. It's now we have, TV, and TV reporters, and that we now know instantly when any major event happens, for good or bad. But again, it's, America in general has been a good country, certainly good for taking poor immigrants and giving them the opportunity, a path to succeed. And I think of myself as a model. I mean, my parents never went to high school. I mean, uh, I'm not even sure my mother could read. I mean, we never had a book in our house, until I was in junior high school, and I got a library card. And I still remember, the librarian said you could take 4 books, and then I said, I mean, I could take them. Suppose I don't bring them back. Well, then you can't ever take any. You can't ever anymore. So it doesn't make sense. You take these, bring these back, you get 4 more or 8 more or something.
Interesting.
But again, I had that mentality as a child, of you survive by stealing, you survive by, by on the underside of the law, and this is what many immigrants did. And in those days, it was immigrants who went to prison, not blacks, not Hispanic. Immigrants from many different nations.
Yeah, that kind of historical perspective helps to put current events into historical perspective. I was thinking again of your model and our previous acknowledgement that probably we would not have been abolitionists if we lived in the 1850s, say, or 1840s, or before the Civil War. And because in a way, slavery wasn't wrong. I mean, it was legal. And, the prevailing belief amongst most people was that blacks were inferior, maybe not even the same species or a subspecies, or, you can read these justifications in the literature by preachers, say, in the South in particular, antebellum South, how they really felt about it. So, would they be morally culpable for embracing slavery? Of course, today we would take down their statues or whatever, but because they don't know what we know. And yet, then, how do you explain the Quakers who stood up against slavery, or maybe rationalists like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and the people that agitated against it, that said this is wrong? Short of they were heroes, but what made them heroes? What are the factors that helped them buck the system?
Yeah, there was a recent documentary on Abraham Lincoln, and in quote, who freed the slaves, but he was very ambivalent, because it meant conceivably losing his following, not getting reelected, and and essentially it was really a change of mind. That is, when all around you, for years and years, slaves were property. Slaves didn't have a name. They were simply, an age, a gender, and not even a name. So they were nothing. They were your property. And and so it really took stepping back from that, as in any situation, stepping back and saying, what's really happening here? What is good about this? What is bad about this? And and then when you say there's more bad than good, what is the action needed to change it, to correct it? And how do I go about that? Can I do it by myself? You could do it within your family. Can I join a group? Like, here's a group of people called Quakers who say, no, this is bad. Slavery is bad for those enslaved and even those who are the slave owners, and it's bad for a nation that supports that. So again, yeah, the abolition movement was really one of the great movements in the world history, and essentially Lincoln finally came around to espouse this, personal position that this cannot be allowed, and no one is allowed to enslave anyone else for any reason. Now, again, historically, the Romans enslaved everybody. You know, uh, that any literally, and it's like Nazis. Anybody you conquered became you're enslaved. Meaning, at the very least, they had to do the work, dirty work for you. Uh, but again, the history of slavery in America uh, is one of the worst things about America. And I should mention, San Francisco is about to create a reparations program to give. It's not clear how much. Maybe it is actual money, but it's also symbolic to all African Americans who can trace their origins back to slavery, and that's a start. And also getting rid of the names of, of former heroes who, in some way, are connected to slavery,
Yeah,
promoting
some
slavery.
some of that can go too far, like canceling Thomas Jefferson because he owned slaves, and he actually he raped Sally Jennings. Well, okay, that's a pretty uncharitable appraisal of Thomas
Right,
Jefferson. I mean, to unite the
right,
country and actually have a country, he had to make compromises with the southern states, and they wanted slavery. So okay, and and also, his wife died, and so here's the woman closest to him. Well, she's black, and how about, as a charitable interpretation, he fell in love with her, and they had children, and he wasn't allowed to
right,
marry because that was
right.
illegal. So they lived together. What, maybe that's a possibility, and wouldn't that be a more loving thing to do? Is, not rape your slave, but fall in love with a black woman and have children with her because you love her. That seems to be a more charitable way to look at it. Anyway, this
Yeah.
this defenestration of everybody that doesn't meet our moral standards that were established, last Tuesday, historically seems pretty problematic, to
No,
me.
but I think, but yeah, your analysis of Jefferson is the one that I've always had, is that here's a really good man, here's a brilliant man, here's a man who made America work, and and had slaves because everybody had slaves. I mean, it's like having farm. It's like if you have a winery in California, you have to have Mexican uh, grape grape
Right, right.
Mexican laborers come at the when it's time to uh, uh, take the grapes off the vines, um, and so you're hiring groups of people, you're giving them work, but typically the working conditions have not been ideal, have not been good, um, and so the idea is that they're saying, well, here, rich Americans, almost enslaving, Mexican laborers, rather than say, what do we have to do to improve the conditions? give them minimum wages, have housing which is adequate, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always I am always focusing on what can we do actually to make a bad situation workable, and then what is the ideal? What would be the ideal?
Yes, well, workers' rights, for example, that movement, the unionization of workers was, some moral progress there, along with children's rights, and children can't be worked as kids and so on. I wanted to bring up another topic along these lines, since you talked about the Lord of the Flies, and that's often used as an example of the darker side of human nature. There was this Guardian article last year, and now a book called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. In which he discovered, quite by chance, this shipwreck of a dozen boys or so, maybe half a dozen boys, on the rocky islet of Tonga, an island group in the Pacific Ocean, and they ended up on this little rock away from that called Ata, A-T-A, where they spent, I think it was 14 months. And in contrast with the Lord of the Flies, they did the opposite. They were cooperative and they worked together. Sometimes they quarreled, but whenever that happened, they solved it by imposing a timeout. Their days began and ended with song and prayer. Kolo, one of the boys, fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires salvaged from the wrecked boat.
Wow.
Yeah, and their spirits needed lifting. They worked together on this all summer long. It hardly rained, so driving the boys frantic with thirst, they tried to constructing a raft, but it fell apart, and so on and so forth. One of the boys fell off a cliff and broke his leg. The other boys hiked down, picked him up, and set his leg, and it ended up healing fine, and so on. So this guy, Rutger Bregman, so his book basically says, the Lord of the Flies was wrong. And the opening of this article in The Guardian is really quite revealing. I mean, he describes the Lord of the Flies thing like it really happened. And then he said, but Golding made this up. It's a novel. Like, nobody knew this was a novel. Of course it's a novel. And that's what novels do. They kind of bore into the deepest, sort of most extreme version of human nature to make a point. Okay. Wasn't necessarily trying to convey this is what all humans are like everywhere. Anyway, I don't know if you're familiar with Nicholas Christakis' book, Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. No. It's a great book. So
I got it.
He outlines a suite of 8 social characteristics that make for a good society or a bad society. So here are the 8. The capacity to have and recognize individual identity, love for partners and offspring, 3, friendship, 4, social networks, 5, cooperation, 6, preference for one's own group, that is in-group bias, 7, mild hierarchy, relative egalitarianism, and 8, social learning and teaching, which would be something along the lines of your heroic project. Anyway, Nicholas has, in this book, a database of shipwrecks with survivors, which he culled from this 1813 work in the genre called, and here's the title of this 1813 work, A Collection of Interesting Accounts of Naval Disasters with Many Particulars of the Extraordinary Adventures and Sufferings of the Crews of Vessels Wrecked at Sea and of their Treatment on Distant Shores. So believe it or not, in this 400-year time span from 1500 to 1900, the survival colonies ranged in population from 4 to 500, with a mean from, from like a year to 5 years, and that they varied considerably, that some survived, some didn't. And anyway, Nicholas kind of characterizes, quote, the groups that typically fared best were those that had good leadership in the form of mild hierarchy without any brutality, friendships among the survivors, and evidence of cooperation and altruism. The successful shipwreck society shared food equitably, took care of the sick and injured survivors, worked together drilling wells, burying the dead, building fires, and building escape boats. There was little hierarchy. For example, while on board, their ship's officers and enlisted men were separated, but on land, successful castaways integrated everyone in a cooperative, egalitarian, and more horizontal structure, putting aside prior hierarchical class differences in the interest of survival. Camaraderie emerged, and friendships across such barriers were formed. And he even has an example of 2 ships that landed at the same time on the same island, but it was a huge island, and they were on other sides of it, and neither one of them knew they were there. One group ended up cooperating along these lines, and all the survivors made it, and were rescued, and the other one, most of them died because they were still hierarchical. So to me, I love this because it shows the complexity of human nature. You can't just say, the Lord of the Flies, that's the way humans are, or the Stanford Prison Experiment, that's the way humans are, or Milgram, or the Nazis, or whatever example you want to use, Enron, My Lai. It's never that simple, right? It depends on what the situation is and the circumstances and who's there to act like a hero and get everybody on board to be more cooperative or not. Anyway, I highly recommend Nicholas's book, Blueprint. It's quite good.
Yeah, I got to read it. Yeah, but it's essentially what you're saying is what's exciting is the complexity of human nature. That the complexity of each of our minds, each individual mind, and then we put these together in a family. We put these together in a group, in a team, in a city, and then in a nation. And so it's, for me, it's always exciting to see these examples, to say, wow, we could go left and be the Lord of the Flies. We could go right and be caring and constructive and help. A mission is to help others succeed, and in the process, we succeed as well. Again, during the pandemic, we've had this incredible thing where they just announced yesterday 400 nurses have died in hospitals treating COVID cases and then getting the disease themselves. And so here the heroes, they say, these heroes don't wear capes, but they,
right.
And the problem, they didn't have the necessary equipment, PE, the equipment that they needed to cover their face. They had little masks, but not the big ones. They didn't have enough gloves and stuff. But these nurses, most of them women, with some men as well, sacrificed their lives to help other people survive during this pandemic. Has really been an evil. And I recently was reading up about the smallpox pandemic, which was really, really horrific. And again, nations and scientists working together. That's the other thing of getting scientists, inventing vaccines, getting engineers developing, shipping, all the things that are involved to get some fluid into your arm so you could live, and get the fluid into their arm, will likely die. So it's been, the heroic story of nurses around the world and first responders, should be a lasting legacy that every nation has. And as we're right now, one of the interesting psychological issues is the high percentage of people in every population who are refusing to get vaccinated. All kinds of reasons, believing it's something put in you to control your mind.
Yeah. They're going to chip you, and they're going to be able to track you wherever you go.
Yeah. Well, the point is, for every person who's not vaccinated, they are a danger to everybody else.
That's right. Yeah.
And so and when you talk about it, it might be as much as a third. Talk about millions. A third is a small number, but a third of 300 million is a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a collective action problem. We always have this in societies that are very individualistic, and yet people are accustomed to collective action problems. Like, how about an interstate highway system? Oh yeah, well, we got to have that. And how about a police force? And how about a fire department? And how about a military? Oh yeah. And, people kind of go along with that because they're used to it, or a public education system, something like that. And yet, I think people get confused about this, like, well, having to wear a mask is a violation of my freedom. Well, restaurants, you can't go nude into a restaurant. They have rules, and you have to give up your freedom. Drive on the right side of the road. You restrict your freedom. I mean, I think people just get confused about what freedom actually means.
Yeah. The two examples I give is wearing seatbelts and wearing helmets. Initially, again, people didn't want to do it. And you make it a law, and B, you make it clear that you could die by not having it. And so you got all these examples. And I know a lot of friends of mine who are students, not me, motorcycle, even who refuse to wear a helmet. And they say, again, it's my free choice. It's not your choice to die, because you don't die. Your brain gets scrambled when you're in an accident, and it costs society lots of money to hospitalize you, et cetera. So you become a burden on society by not doing this simple thing of putting a helmet on. So getting the fact that people now, you get something which was unusual, putting a seatbelt on, it's automatic. You want to make things like that become habits. Habit is an action you take without thinking. So you shouldn't have to think, should I put my belt on? Should I put my helmet on? And that's where you have a functioning society where people develop habits that are good for themselves, but also are good for cooperative habits, good for the rest of society.
Yeah, we just had a guy die up here at the end of my street. I'm up in the mountains above Santa Barbara, and he went off road. The paved road turns into a dirt road, and he hit a pothole, and the car flipped, but he had no seatbelt on, so he was ejected, but only partially ejected, and the car then landed on top of him, and he was killed instantly. Yeah. So in cycling, for example, back in the 80s, no one wanted to wear helmets all the way up into the early 90s, because it feels better to just have the wind in your hair and it's cooler and whatever. But then finally the governing body said, there's too much liability and deaths and accidents and brain damage. And so you're all going to wear a helmet or you can't compete, period. Like, okay. And then everybody started wearing them, and now you just feel naked without a helmet. So that's a shift from the top down, but then the norms change, and now I couldn't imagine driving without a seatbelt or cycling without my helmet. Anyway, I wanted to ask you something. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well,
no, I was going to say that's a great example. Yeah. That right there that's why I always use that seatbelts and helmets that were resisted and fought, and then they become a habit, and you can't imagine not doing it. That's the thing is.
Yeah, so David Buss and I were talking about all these big issues on the podcast, and then afterwards I said, hey, I'm going to be talking to Phil, so what would you like me to ask him? So he said, I'll just read what he said. I don't have any problems with what he demonstrated or purported to demonstrate in the Stanford Prison Experiment, but my question has always been, the situation is an underspecified explanation. Humans must have underlying psychological machinery, functional machinery designed to respond to specific situations. In this case, I can well envision that putting people in positions of power, for example, guards, triggers adaptations to exploit those situations and sometimes to abuse them. For example, there have been women prisoners. Had there been women prisoners in your Stanford Prison Experiment, my guess is that some of the exploitation would have been sexual, as does happen in real prisons and has happened in death camps in World War II. Especially if it was part of their job to keep the prisoners in line. At the same time, there must be adaptations in humans to respond in adaptive ways to being in subordinate positions where they are relatively powerless, perhaps ingratiating themselves with those in power or forming alliances or coalitions with other prisoners to resist abuse, for example, cooperative coalition action. And again, if there were female prisoners, one can imagine women using sexual resources to obtain special favors or to prevent being punished. So to me, the question I would pose to Phil is, what are the underlying psychological adaptations responsible for evoking the behavior in guards and prisoners?
That's a great. David Buss just outlined the whole theory. It's never simple. It's never obvious when you say it's the situation. Situations are in fact mental as well as physical. So So in fact, the prison study was a hallway, a basement hallway, uh, uh, where 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 graduate students had their offices. We had to get rid of them in the summer, and we so it was is nowhere near a real prison. Solitary confinement was a closet. So what I'm saying is the prison was really a prison of the mind, and that when when uh, when the Hollywood movie was being planned, the, the director came down and couldn't believe when they walked down this yard, and the yard is a hallway 20 feet long. Yeah, 20 feet long, 6 feet wide. It's a hallway in a basement. Um, but the point is, when you take pictures of what it looked like before we did it, and then afterwards, you can't imagine that in the minds not only of the students but of me and my staff, that became the prison yard, and their little cells with fake bars on became prison cells. So the really interesting thing for me was that it was a prison of the mind, that it was a, a basement in the psychology department in Jordan Hall. You walk down a flight of steps and you were in prison, um, and uh, and of course it took a while to adjust because it's 1971. No one wanted to be a guard because the Vietnam War was on. Students were protesting that illegal, immoral war. College administrators called police onto the campus to quell the riots. There was, physical fights, physical confrontations, and so police were called pigs. I remember students used to put tags on police cars, oink oink, and then by extension, uh, guards were also uh, disliked. So again, when we asked, and as in the movie, they asked each one, "Would you want to be a prisoner or guard?" No one wanted to be a prison guard. So it's not well here. People with sadistic impulses, oh, I'm going to be in charge. I can. No, nobody wanted to be a prison guard because people who were in positions of power were seen as wrong, seen as evil, seen as part of this immoral war.
What do you think would happen had you had some women who were either prisoners or guards in your experiment?
Well, the interesting thing is when I finished the study, that's the first thing I did is I applied to say I'd like to do a study, but would have to be all female guards and all
Mm.
female prisoners, and of course turned down. I really asked, it was turned down because they said your study is now quote unethical. People suffered, so there cannot be any variations of it. And in fact, what's interesting now is um, you cannot do any research that creates psychological stress on the participants. So, for example, uh, if you wanted to do research on forgiveness, psychology of forgiveness, under what conditions would somebody who is the victim of some crime would forgive the perpetrator? Uh, you can't ask somebody, for example, a student, to say, imagine you were raped and we caught the rapist and he wants you to forgive him. And in the experiment, we're going to vary different kinds of requests for forgiveness. You can't do that because a woman thinking about being raped is causing stress. So what that means now is a lot of interesting questions can never be handled experimentally anymore. Not even at this level of um, imaginative imaginative scenarios rather than enacted scenarios.
So there we have to turn to natural experiments, things that just happened that you after the fact study. So Abu Ghraib, there were women at Abu Ghraib, right?
Yeah. Well, there were women in Abu Ghraib. There were women guards. It's not clear why. It was the first time ever. There were several women on the night shift, along with many men, and several of those women were having sex with the other guards, with male guards. I mean, So it was women, American women guards and American male guards. Several of the women were having regular sex with the male guards, and many of those women did equally bad things with the men. There's a picture of one of the women dragging a naked prisoner around with a leash on his neck as if he was an animal. That's one of the worst images of all. And I was an expert witness for one of the guards there, Chip Frederick, and I got to see all of the thousands of photos and videos because it was at the time people just started having digital cameras. So that's why it's the first time ever where they took pictures of everything. Now, all the abuses happened only on the night shift. There was no abuse on the day shift. So this is a situational variable. And it turns out on the night shift, for the 3-month period where they were doing all this terrible thing, so they were doing terrible things to prisoners who were supposed to be interrogated about, interrogated about
terrorism attacks,
terrorism, various terrorism that was likely, and so the American guards were supposed to, in quote, loosen up the prisoners so they would talk, and for some reason that was not told to the guards on the day shift. So the guards on the day shift, didn't take any pictures. There was not a single incident of irregularity. And on the night shift, it just fell apart. I mean, they were doing all this abuse, simulating sodomy with the prisoners, forcing the prisoners to simulate fellatio and sodomy, etc. So it was an instance of, here's a situation that what I was going to say, I apologize, is that there's no evidence that for 3 months there was no senior official, who went down to no captain, no colonel, no higher up went down to see what was happening, or even to be observing from a distance. So essentially that was the Lord of the Flies. I mean, that is, at some point they felt we could do whatever we want. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. And then it was only one of them blew the whistle. Exposed what was happening. But it was the pictures. It was taking the pictures. They were proud of what they were doing. So they didn't. Given that they thought of these Iraqis as animals and dragging them around they didn't think that what they were doing was wrong. So again, many of the prisoners were naked, all the time. They didn't have uniforms, and so in their mind, these are like animals, and we could treat them any way we want.
After those initial articles came out criticizing your Stanford Prison Experiment, I posted on Twitter, pictures of Abu Ghraib and pictures from the Stanford Prison Experiment with the bags over the head and the leash and the naked prisoners, and it's like, okay, even if Phil made this whole thing up, the whole thing was fake, and it tells us nothing. Right. How do you explain Abu Ghraib, which looks exactly the same? Right. And it's not like Phil went in there and said, "Here's what you're supposed to do," or that any military leaders went down there and said, "Here's how we want you to treat the prisoners at night." This just happened, and so it's a natural experiment.
Right. Yeah, and I should mention is that I was an expert witness for one of the guards, Chip Frederick. He was a staff sergeant. He was the senior guard on that senior person on that night shift, and he ended up doing some of these bad things as well. And there are pictures of him. And when the images were released, it was a huge embarrassment to American foreign policy, and so he was the one that they were going to throw the book at. So they put him on trial, and they were going to give him 15 years of hard labor, and and his lawyer contacted me, and I actually had to go to a secret place in a secret site, uh, and I was interviewed by the judge, virtually on television. And my testimony was that I spent several weeks doing all background checks of this man. I actually had him come to my home with his wife. I spent a day with him, and I talked to his parents. I talked to friends. And he's a really good guy. I mean, that is, he was an ideal soldier. He had many medals and awards. He worked with children in other countries. And so he was a classic situation. They put him in this situation on the night shift by chance. He could have been on the day shift, and he got seduced into this evil that was going on. And so my defense was a psychological one. Your Honor, he's guilty, as charged. I mean, and he admits it, and he's sorry for what he did. He has no explanation for what he did, but it's what I would call he gave in to the power of the situation. I mentioned the prison study a little bit, and my testimony got his sentence reduced from 15 years to 4. And so that's one of the first times psychological defense has had a major legal impact on the court.
How much of that case, though, was just a more Machiavellian manipulation by the military to say, it's just a few bad apples. Our system is perfectly moral and fine. And so therefore they have to target somebody as the bad apple.
Yeah, but they made him, but I'm saying he's a good apple. So I literally said he's a good apple.
Right.
And the military put him in a bad barrel. And that, that notion of, and so what my argument has now always been, we have to understand the apple, and we understand the personality, the background, the character of the person. We have to understand the barrel, that's the situation. But what we have ignored is the bad barrel makers. And this is the system that creates, so this is the military system that created Abu Ghraib, night shift, and then dumped good apples in there, and they all. So it's every single person on the night shift did those terrible things. I mean, we have videos, we have films of every single one of the 9 guards on the night shift, including the women, did terrible things night after night after night at least for 3 months long.
Let's just kind of wrap it up then and kind of give a bigger perspective. I was going to ask you this question I have in my mind that I don't have an answer to. That is, to what extent are we by nature pretty gullible, or are we more naturally skeptical? Here I was thinking of Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday, in which he argues that, for example, in Nazi Germany, most Germans were not on board with the whole National Socialism exterminationist program. They liked some of the economic policy, the Autobahns, and so on. But it took great effort to get, regular Germans to become goose-stepping Nazis and killing Jews and so on. He also points out that most political advertising doesn't work. Most people don't join cults. You have that section on Jim Jones and Jonestown and, right. Drinking the Kool-Aid and all that. But, most people don't do that kind of thing. It takes a lot of steps and circumstances and so on to get people to go to those extremes. So just kind of you're 88 years old, you're reflecting back on your whole career studying this stuff. To what extent do you think we are, we're gullible and can fall for these things, or we're mostly skeptical, or a mix of the two, or just kind of put it all in perspective for us?
Well, I think we're not sufficiently skeptical, and that's where your life's work has been critical, important, that the importance of always being skeptical until proven otherwise. That is, I think many of us have become gullible. We believe something that we see over and over again. We give in, we do join movements, we join movements that we think are good, and that we don't really ask questions about who's in charge necessarily. Again, with the Jim Jones cult at Jonestown, these are ordinary people from San Francisco and Los Angeles, several thousands of them, many of them poor blacks, but they're also, you know, upper class whites. There was lawyers and other people who in quote had the knowledge and awareness to know better, and they were simply seduced by this you know, silver tongue orator, they would call him. But but yeah, but again, it's you know, I just think human nature is wonderful to study because of the complexity, because you know there are the Jim Joneses of the world, and on the other hand, there are people like you who right the ship to say, yeah, yes, but notice, and that's what I've tried to do, to say, you know, yeah, and the prisons say, look how easy it is for good people to turn evil when you put them in that position of power, in that setting, um, and then the highlight is we don't want to have situations in real prisons that give this possibility, for once good guards to do bad things to prisoners.
All right, last question. I wanted to ask you to put the last year and a half into perspective, being careful about the recency effect and the availability heuristic. But, you know, we've gone through a pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and all the protests and the Capitol storming and the riots in Seattle and Portland. It's been pretty crazy. But you lived through 1968, the assassination of King and Kennedy, the Vietnam War, Watergate, all those protests and terrorist attacks back then. You know, so just kind of put the recent year into perspective for what you've observed in your life.
Yeah, life is complicated, and that's what makes it wonderful. Is that it's it's unpredictable, and it's what's important is that we all have to be social observers of life that we're in, life around us. We have to be educated by people who are knowledgeable about the situation, not seduced by TV journalists. And there are no easy answers to why people do bad things, but we have to understand what is a situation in which people like me could do bad things, and it's been an exciting, dramatic year. I mean, literally, it's a year like no other. This past year, and even more than the Vietnam War protests, et cetera, et cetera. It's with the foundation of the pandemic, and then you know the human rights violations, and for the first time protests, you know, around in virtually every city in America, and even around the world, about human rights violations, police abuse of authority, sexual abuse of people in authority. So it's been an exciting year for an old socialist.
Well, the last chapter of the Lucifer Effect is a pretty optimistic one about heroism. So I gather you remain fairly optimistic despite the tumultuousness of the last year and a half.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think ultimately we will train our next generation to be what we call everyday heroes, stand up, speak out, and change the world by their actions. So our program now is we're making our program down to it was first high school, college. Now we want middle school and ultimately elementary school. Because it's elementary kids, all of whom have these visions of heroes. So instead of mythical heroes or Superman, you know, I always tell students, every superhero envies you because you have something they don't have. They say, "What is that?" You have a brain. Every super Wonder Woman, whatever it is the brainchild of a cartoonist, and they can only do one thing: they can fly, they can have bullets bound. So your brain means that you can do everything, almost everything that is humanly possible. And so the idea is use your brain wisely, use your brain often, use your brain well, and keep it sharp.
Perfectly
so that's
said.
my message.
And perfectly said. And at age 88, your brain is still as sharp as I remember it from decades ago. Thanks for coming on the show, Phil. But most importantly, thank you for your lifelong work. It's super important and interesting. So, good job.
Thank you. It's always a joy to be with you.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later.